In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by the behalf of them through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So, right now, we want to talk a little bit about how demons actually attack another aspect of understanding of marriage, or several aspects of marriage. And one of them is the idea that really marriage is a call to sacrifice. If you look in the Old Testament and you look at the spiritual writers, the theologians, they say there's three elements of every sacrifice. The offertory, you have to set the thing aside and offer it to God. Two, you have to slay the victim. So you would offer the sheep. That's what the Jews would do. They'd offer the sheep to God, then they would slay it, and then you would consume the victim so that nothing that was used in the sacrifice would go to profane use. Okay. So those are the three elements: offertory, slaying of the victim, and then the consummation, consuming it. In marriage, it actually meets the structure of a sacrifice. So actually, let's back up. So if you look at Christ, the offertory is done in the Garden of Olives. Not my will, but thine be done. The slaying of the victim, he's actually goes through the passion, and then the consummation is at the end. He's completed everything that's necessary. The soul separates from the body, and it's completed. So the three elements are right there. In marriage, the offertory is the proposal, will you marry me? That's the offertory. And then when the person says yes, that's the offertory back. The demons attack this by not having a proper courtship. This is one of the ways, you've heard me talk a little bit about this before, where they try and set up the relationship before to where people are engaging in things that are inappropriate at certain times in order to affect the relationship going into the marriage. They don't follow the proper rules of courtship, or they have too long of a courtship, or not long enough of a courtship. One time a friend of mine had been dating a girl for 6 years. I said, this is unjust. You either marry her or tell her to go away. One of the two. He ended up marrying her. She's a great gal and they have a good marriage. But it's like, it's time to get moving here. The offertory, can you hear me now? The offertory, thank you, Father. The offertory is the proposal. There's an offering. Are you willing to do this? And the offering is, I'm offering you bodily rights in relationship to me. That's the offertory. And so this is important because parents have to watch over that beginning process to make sure that before the offertory is ever done, before there's any offering or proposal, that things are actually in place. One of the common things that I probably get it about once or twice a month. A married couple will approach me and say, my daughter, or son for that matter, is dating somebody who's bad for them. So I tell them, well, there's a very simple solution. You basically just say a binding prayers against any demons, or prayers against any demons that are keeping them together. Because demons can drive those amorous feelings, as I mentioned. And so it's like clockwork. It's literally like clockwork. There's only one case where the woman had to do the mother had to do the binding prayers for about 2 months. It's always within 3 to 4 weeks, that the bad person in the relationship will leave. It's pretty common. So the offertory, and so the demons are actually trying to affect that process by which the offertory is made, or the proposal is made, and all the precursors that go up to the marriage, because they're trying to jade the relationship before the marriage. Next is the slaying of the victim. This is when the person, this is the actual, when the people actually exchange vows. That's when you're dying to yourself in marriage. By saying, do you take him to be your husband? Yes, then you're giving bodily rights to him. That means you've died to your sole control over your body, and now he has a certain amount of rights in relationship to that, and vice versa, that she has rights in relationship to him. That's the slaying of the victim. That's when you have to die to yourself by virtue of the fact that you're making a promise before God to do certain things that are now outside your control. And that's not always going to be in accord with your will. It's part of the dying. Once people are married, they expect things from their spouse rather than seeing it as a form of serving each other. This is a problem. That is, people don't see marriage as an opportunity to serve each other. They're just thinking about, what am I getting out of this? St. Joseph was there to serve God by taking care of Mary and Jesus. Our Lady called herself the handmaid. Handmaid means servant, literally. Do it to me according to thy word, not mine. But she said she wanted God's word to be done. So how she served was not her determination. How we serve in marriage is not a determination. It's determined by the church and the circumstances that God determines in your lives, the children he sends to you, etc. And yet Our Lady perfectly accepted whatever God wanted in relationship to that. So there has to be that willingness to die to yourself to serve the other individual. This death, this dying to yourself, is a lifelong process. It's not just at the day of your marriage. It's just not throughout the beginning process. It's ultimately, this dying is that God is calling you to that. It's an ongoing sacrifice for the totality of the duration of your marriage, because you've entered into a contract which you don't have your rights. You don't get them back until the other spouse dies, basically. The demons are going to try and jade that by doing what? Driving people to be selfish. Now, this is just part of original and actual sin, but the principal thing that they're going to try and do is drive them expecting, the spouses will be expecting certain things from the other spouse all the time. And you even kind of see this. One of the sins against marriage, against spouses, is called ill use. This is the guy who does throw his socks onto the floor, right? Or the wife who just, doesn't, or spends an extraordinary amount of money on stuff that's not necessary, and as a result the husband has to work more in order to cover what's being spent. But there's different ways in which this is done, but the demons will actually drive people to become very selfish and expect the other person to render to them what they want. Now, obviously, if it's the marital debt, there's a certain legitimacy in that because they have a right to it. On the other hand, there's certain things that the person shouldn't expect. That is, there should be a kind of selfish. It shouldn't be what you're going to get from your spouse. It's what you're going to give to them. It should be really the mindset. But the demons are do what? The first thing the demon did when he sinned is choose himself and what he wanted over the will of God. That's what he did. His very act was by nature selfish. Well, they replicate hell in our lives. So that means that in marriage, they're constantly trying to make the spouses selfish in relationship to a discussion or in relationship to an expectation, or thinking that they owe this to me or what have you, rather than how am I going to serve my spouse the best. The next is the consuming of the victim. This means it has to be total and complete. The consummation of marriage, there's two ways that this is done. The consummation of marriage after they're married, right? They engage in the conjugal acts, and from that point on, boom, nobody can divide it, not even the Pope. Okay. So this means that part of that is the consuming of the victim means it has to be total, which means that any time the reasonable request is made, you have to render it. But the second one is that they have to serve each other selflessly. You should not be going into marriage thinking about what you're getting out of it. You should actually be going into marriage thinking about how am I serving God and how am I going to be doing good for my spouse and my children. That should be ultimately what you should be doing, because you have to die to yourself completely, and it's through your spouse, it's through your marriage that's done. Most spouses have the same attitude that a nun did when she wrote Spiritual Daughter. I think it was a Padre Pio, but don't quote me. It might have been John of the Cross. But she wrote to him and said, I would be a much holier nun if it wasn't for all these other nuns in the convent. I can't tell you how many times I hear spouses say, I'd be a lot holier if my husband would just get his act together. Or I would be a lot holier if I just didn't have to deal with my wife's nagging, or whatever the case is. Right? And I'm like, oh no. I have the same response that John of the Cross had, or Padre Pio, which is, oh no, it's that person's imperfections that are precisely the means of your sanctification. It's precisely because your husband is a slob and lazy is how you are going to master charity. And it's precisely in her nagging that you're going to master that love of somebody and doing good for them despite how they feel. Because quite frankly, that's exactly what God did. If you look at the cross is the absolute inversion of everything that is diabolic. The cross is the manifestation of returning what Christ said, returning good for evil. We committed sin. In return, he offered his life to us for our salvation. The demons are the opposite. God was so good to them in what he initially gave to them, and they turned around, and instead of rendering good for good, they rendered evil for good. In marriage, you have a choice. You are either going to end up following the path of the demons, or you're going to follow the path of God. You're either going to render good for evil to your spouse, or you're going to end up rendering evil for good. One or the other. There's no way around it. And so the point is that you have to look at your marriage and say, is my real intention in relationship to my spouse to be good to them? You can say, do you love your wife? Yeah, I love my wife. Well, why are you doing this to her then? Because she annoys me. What does her annoyance have to do with the price of tea in China as far as you're rendering her good? There's this attitude that, I will render the person good as long as they're being good to me. Well, if that's the case, you might as well just pack your bags and move to another location, because that's just not going to happen in marriage all the time. Hopefully it happens most of the time, but you just have to realize that even when people want to do the good, they're just going to cause harm to each other. It's just the nature of original and actual sin. But it's precisely through those things that people can grow holy. When your spouse does something against you, there's two things that the demons are going to say, see, you've got to cut him off, you've got to do this, or see, she's doing this to you, and so just go out to your man cave and ignore her for the next 3 days. Right? So this is the temptation that the demons are going to put, because they're constantly trying to divide, because it's through division that they can conquer. Rather than what? St. Thomas says that the principal effect of love is union. When you love something, you want to be one with it. That's just the nature of it. Okay, so if you really love your spouse, you're going to want to be one with them, but that means you're going to have to remove the obstacles, and those obstacles are primarily your own interior emotional disorders in relationship to them. People say, well, how do I know what my vice is? Well, do you have anger? Yeah, well, there you go. All you have to do is watch your emotional reactions in relationship to your spouse, and that will tell you. I think having spouses together, putting them together, is a fantastic thing, because you can find out an enormous amount of people's interior lives and how virtuous they are by how they treat each other. If they're constantly beating each other up, you're just like, boy, you haven't mastered, and you can just go down the litany. Right? And so sometimes people come to me and they say, how do you master these, what St. Thomas calls antecedent appetites? See, our emotions either follow reason, or they occur before and contrary to reason. Well, if they occur before and contrary to reason, that means you don't have virtue. Because if they're virtuous, virtue is literally the life of reason. And so as you start to gain virtue in a particular area, when you gain the virtue of meekness, your spouse will do something, and there will be absolutely no reaction on your part in relationship to this whatsoever. What reminds me of that commercial, I don't know if you saw it, it was a football commercial where there's this referee, he's standing there, and the two coaches are screaming in this guy's ear, and he's just standing there like this, like nothing's happening. And the announcers are like, look at him, he's a rock. Nobody is getting to him. He's not even listening to anything they're saying. Look at it, nothing's getting to him. And then they pan into his face, and they pan out, and his wife is in his ear. Okay. What does this mean? It means he's tuned her out, and in the meantime, what did that do? It made his wife even worse, because now she's trying to control him anymore because he won't do what she wants. I tell women, look, this is exactly the dynamic that demons are trying to do, but this tells you that you should really be rendering good for evil in marriage. If you do that consistently, When we do something bad but somebody does good back to us, it causes a natural softness in our hearts in relationship to them. We feel bad and we want to do right by them. This is exactly what you need in marriage. Whereas the demons are going to do the opposite. They're going to get you to do bad for bad rather than good for evil. The demons then also attack the goods of marriage, and there's different kinds of goods of marriage. There's a few of them. The primary purpose of marriage, of course, is children, which we've talked about. Now, this is attacked, as I mentioned, by not getting people to have children or be generous with God in relationship to just allow Him to determine the number of children that they have. But it also the attack in recent years is trying to get people to believe that there's not a primary end of marriage. What most people don't understand is that there's actually a difference between the primary end of the natural law institution of marriage and the sacrament of marriage. The primary end of the natural institution of marriage is children, and then all those other things are secondary in relationship to that. In fact, the reason the guy works is to provide for the children, provide for his wife so she can take care of the children. And as I mentioned, even romance is ultimately ordered towards having children. But the fact that we've completely divorced those two is it's a sign of our culture, is, as I mentioned before, slowly slipping into insanity. But the finality, the primary end of the sacrament of matrimony is the mutual salvation of the spouses. This is why the church, those two things, that is, for the sake of having children, etc., this is why one of the things that the demons will very often do is attack the matrimony by doing two specific things. One is chiseling away at the spouses so that they're not really helping each other save each other's souls. That's your primary job, is to get your spouse into heaven. The second thing is in relationship to children, not just blocking them from actually having children, but setting up a situation where the children take precedence over the spouses. The fact of the matter is that the primary obligation that a woman has is not to her children. Her primary obligation is to her husband. The primary obligation that the husband has is to his wife, not to the children. It's why? Is because actually that's because of the contractual obligation. Eventually the children are going to be gone. Now, that doesn't mean that the spouses don't sacrifice, etc. But how would we know this? Well, it's pretty easy. You know, if some guy walks in here and he starts shooting people, you know, you're not going to take your wife and put them in front of the kids, right, to shield them. You're going to put yourself there ultimately. But which is actually, this is one of the things I've always wondered, by the way. One of the signs that masculinity has completely collapsed. When I grew up, if some guy would have walked into a classroom with a gun, he might have got a few shots off, but the entire class of men would have completely bombarded. They would have completely taken that guy out. They wouldn't have cared how many guys died. They're going to take that guy out. Now they're all cowering off in the corner. I'm like, what? Literally, okay, so 2 or 3 guys would have died, but they would have saved 20 or 30 kids, but instead, that's not happening. Okay, that all being said, I don't want to get into a rant. But the point is well, maybe I do, but I have to control that. But the point is that what happens is that very often there's a triangulation that starts to happen within marriage when kids come around, where the parents will start favoring the children over the spouse, or they'll actually allow the children to create this triangulation, which demons are constantly trying to undermine authority. So what they'll do is they'll go to dad and say, "Hey, Dad, can we go to the park?" And the dad says, "No, because you've got to go out and do this thing." Okay. So then they run over to mom. "Mom, can we go to the park?" "Yeah, that's fine. Go over there. Go over. You can go to the park." And so there's this they're constantly trying to set up this contravening of the authorities within the family, so that they don't follow proper authority structure. That's the one thing that demons follow. Once you've lost grace, and once you've lost love and the ability to love, and once you've lost all the goodness and everything else, there's only one thing left: power. That's it. In hell, there's only one thing left, is power. And they have a very strict pecking order in hell. So but what's ironic is that when the demons get involved in everything else, they're constantly chiseling away at that authority structure. Constantly. So they're constantly chiseling away in the mind of the wife about her husband's headship. The husband, this is something that you're seeing rather commonly, will very often disrespect the legitimate authority the wife has over the children as their mother. And so even though he has the final say, nevertheless, if a child won't do what the mother legitimately has told the child, it's the father's place to step in and tell him, no, you're going to do it. And if you don't do it, step outside and we'll put an end to this. The point being is that there has to be that maintaining of the authority structure, because the demons are going to be constantly chiseling away at that. And that means the second thing is that marriage is so to save your souls, but then also for the sake of the children. So that's what it's ordered towards. But the spouse's ordering is to the children through the other spouse, ultimately. The second purpose is mutual help and moral regulation of the satisfaction of the sexual urge, according to the moralists. Mutual help. What does this mean? This is where the board comes in. They have to help each other. By the way, I've mentioned this before, the primary obligation for every single thing in the house, the primary obligation to make sure that it's all taken care of, resides with the husband. The wife is just simply there to help him do his job. That's her function. So when I hear guys say, "Oh, I never change diapers, that's a woman's job." Oh, really? Technically, it's your job as the father. Your wife just happens to be here because God put her here to help you out with it. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that women and men have a distinction of roles based upon dispositions and what we call natural delegation. But there's certain dispositions. I mean, obviously, women are just a lot better taking care of kids, a large number of kids. And how do we know this? And this is one of the things, like, you see this with men. You get 6 kids with a guy, especially when they're young, and after about three hours, it's time for him to go to the rubber room. Whereas the wife can kind of keep track of it, and it doesn't bother her. It's kind of hard for her at times, it's true, but she can kind of deal with it a little bit better because she's got the dispositions. The other thing is that men and women are different in the sense that they multitask differently. Men actually there's a technical term for it, it's called inattentional blindness. It's the ability to focus on one thing and tune everything else out. That's why he's flipping through the channels, the wife's talking to him, and he doesn't hear a thing she says. Why is that important? Because you have to be able to focus on your job, and when you go to war to fight the battle, you have to be able to tune everything out. That's actually why they removed women from the front lines during the first Gulf War, because they found out even with training, when the bullets started to fly, they couldn't tune it out because they're not structured in their brain to do that. Rather, they're intended to do what? To keep track of a number of different things superficially. Why? For the sake of children. This is why women can be changing the diapers, and the kids are upstairs trying to burn the house down, and she just all of a sudden, "What are you guys doing up there?" And the kid's like, "I know she has eyes in the back of her head. She has to. There's no way she could know this," right? Women are structured that way. It's a perfection. It's a good thing for the sake of having children, right? Whereas a guy, he just changes the diaper, and in the meantime, the house is already half burnt down before he even realizes there's smoke in the room. All right. So, but they both have their specific places. But the point is that the demons have been, and you see this in our culture, they have systematically destroyed the value of the different roles of men and women. The value of them. When they did brain studies on women, they found out that a woman, the speech center in her brain is 3 times the size of a man's, and she gets 10 times the amount of pleasure out of talking that a man does. It's a perfection when it's moderated. Why is it? They found out that if you don't talk regularly with and at children from the age of 10 months to 5 years, it will literally cause brain damage. And that's why God gave that perfection to women, because it's easier for them to talk to the children, and it gets them, and it's also necessary to help the children learn to have proper relationships and emotionally bond, etc. But that's why it's there. These are perfections. But this tells you that there's a role for women. Because it's a perfection that men don't have. So guys are designed more to be quiet and to focus on other things, etc. But there's different perfections in men and women, and as a result of that, the fact that they're destroying these things is sad. In fact, if you look at it and you listen to the feminist movement, you look at what's going on in a culture, it's sad at the fact that all these perfections that women have been denigrated, ignored, lessened, and treated like there's something wrong with them. Right? Like the fact that a woman has a strong natural inclination to want to be with her children. No, you should go out and get a job. Right? The fact that they have these different roles based on their perfections, the demons have been chiseling away with that. Why? Because they're trying to get to the children. They know if they mess up the relationship with the parents, they can get to the children. And that's their goal, to mess the children up. Their goal is to wound us. Why? Because when you're wounded, you're weak. Now, this is an important point because one of the most damaging things that demons drive in relationships of marriage is getting the spouses to argue in front of the children. Why does that cause damage? Children have a natural inclination to respect and love the authority of their parents. And so when they are hurting each other in front of them, they're literally stuck in this situation where there is emotional damage because they actually have to choose between one or the other when they don't want to. This is why I tell people, look, unless your wife or your husband is strangling the children, and I literally mean that they're strangling them or drowning them or beating them to the point where the kid's going to end up in the hospital, you don't say anything in front of the children when it comes to harsh words or anything like that, period. So all the minor stuff, you just, and I tell this with wives, don't say anything. Don't countermand his authority. You're just going to end up with this problem of it affecting the children. I tell women, and this is what the demons are after. The demons are after this. I'm going to incite the wife to find what the husband's doing annoying and to get her to correct him. Why? Because then the children learn that instead of being subordinate to right order authority, you can countermand them. Then the wife wonders, why are my kids disobedient? They learned it from you. That's where it came from, and that's what the demons are actually after. Then, of course, what are the demons trying to do? The demons are trying to do to get the husband to not treat the wife with any kind of respect, because why? They want to do two things. Children learn the relationship that they're supposed to have with the opposite sex from their parents. So what happens? Psychologically, they just learn this implicitly. They make these associations. They see this going on. When the husband is treating the wife terribly, when the men go out there, they'll start treating the wives terribly, and they're not even, or their girlfriends terribly, and they don't even know why. It's because they've already got this association. It's the way to cause damage. And when the wife doesn't submit, the girls will learn that, and so this is what they end up learning in relationship to taking that on. They're trying to get to the children. So I tell people, look, instead of arguing in front of the children, never argue in front of the children, unless, again, he's literally murdering them. Then you step in. Otherwise, even if it's a minor defect or something, you leave it alone. And then what you do is you talk about it behind the scenes, quietly and respectfully, but this also means two things. It means, one, is you don't argue because you're trying to maintain the fact that if the children know that if I ask mom and she says no, there's no point in going to dad because he's going to say, what did your mother say? Whereas if they can get that contravening thing, it's just a way to manipulate them and get what they want, as I mentioned, triangulation. But the other side of it is as I mentioned again, is you want to make sure that they understand that how that actual authority structure works in relationship to children. But the part of it is that when they learn that the husband was always respectful of his wife, they never argued, and the wife was respectful of the authority of the husband. That's the type of father or husband that the father, because women marry their fathers very often. That's the type of husband they're going to start looking for. And the children know that. The definition of peace is the tranquility of order. When the spouses are arguing, there's not order and there will not be peace in the family. And that's exactly the attack the demons are trying to do. They're trying to upset things because why? They're trying to upset the peace that children need in order to develop virtue. When kids, because why? Again, remember when I said that if you have an antecedent emotion, that's a sign you don't have any virtue? Well, if your parents are arguing all the time, there's this upsettingness, and so you're literally trying to grow in virtue in an environment that is just causing all these antecedent appetites, so it becomes more difficult. The demons are extraordinarily smart. They understand exactly how this stuff works. The other good of marriage is they say that St. Augustine says this is a remedy for concupiscence. This is how to keep people chaste within the confines of marriage. Okay. Attacks on the properties of marriage. First property is unity, monogamy. And there's different kinds of unity. There's intellectual emotional unity. And remember, I mentioned that the diabolic attack is first to attack the perceptions, because they have to drive that destruction of the intellectual unity that the spouses have. This is also one of the reasons why it's so dangerous to get married in a mixed marriage, because you're starting out your marriage without intellectual unity off the bat about some of the most essential things that govern marriage and raising of children, which is the moral life. And there also is this emotional unity. This is also why you can't follow your emotions in marriage, because the demons have that influence, and in order to have emotional unity, you have to develop virtue. In the end, you'll see this. In the spouses that are trying to grow holy together and work on their virtues, and they go to their own corners and work on their own defects, this is one of the things. Don't go into marriage again expecting your spouse to change. Don't expect your spouse to change. You have to change in relationship to your spouse. One of the things I'll often tell guys that are in religious communities when they're getting angry with how the superiors are dealing with things like, okay, the superior is probably doing something bad. That's probably true. It's irrelevant as to what your response needs to be. Your response needs to be virtue, not anger. Then there's physical unity. And physical unity, God made us as human beings that we actually develop a bond for people by being tactile, showing proper affection in a rightly ordered way. And this lack of affection or lack of rendering the conjugal act can detract, that lack of physical unity can detract from it. You'll see this from time to time when guys get married after about 2 or 3 years. Showing a certain amount of affection for your wife requires a certain amount of energy. And so eventually they're just like, it's not worth it, right? When they're first dating, they want to show it to him because they're hoping to get something. But until then, after they're married, after a little while, they're like, there's no point in it. But that affection, that physical affection that's rightly ordered according to modesty and according to their state in life, is something that the demons can't stand. They cannot stand rightly ordered affections. Why? Because they hate everybody and hate everything, and they don't want anyone else enjoying those affections for each other. Spiritual unity. Again, I mentioned the dangers of mixed marriage. Sometimes they turn out okay, sometimes they don't. But without unity and belief, there will always be a lack of intellectual unity among the partners, and the demons will chisel away at this. The other side of it is again, the demon's goal is the children. According to the fathers, one of the sins that Eve committed was usurpation. See, she usurped the authority that Adam had in determining the code, that is, the moral behavior of the members of the family. It's his obligation to determine the code and the cult, they said. That is, the worship and the moral life that plugs into that worship and is the antecedent and leads to that worship. It's the husband's place to oversee that and to make sure that it's actually done and kept in place. The primary obligation to make sure that the spiritual lives of the children and the wife are advancing is the husband's, not the other way around. If a husband doesn't do that, and demons constantly chisel at this, they will constantly get the husband to be a spiritual slacker and just leave it to his wife. It's effeminate, quite frankly. Because to be disciplined spiritually is hard, it's difficult, and that's what men are supposed to do. They're supposed to deal with hard and difficult things. But they will work at that. But the problem with mixed marriages is if the husband isn't Catholic, the fathers say the husband's place is to confirm the code and the cult. So when the wife teaches it, it's his place to confirm, yes, this is how you worship God. This is how you pray. This is how you are to behave. But if he's not that way, the wife can train the kids till the cows come home, and almost inevitably, not always, but a large portion of the children coming out of that are spiritually tepid at best, because there hasn't been that confirmation psychologically. If the wife isn't Catholic and the husband is, you might have the confirmation, but the wife's not going to teach the cult and the code, and so the children never get a thorough, deep grasp of the spiritual life. This is one of the reasons why I tell people, just don't get involved with mixed marriages. Then, of course, they work against the sacramental unity. Once the people are married, that's it. It's indivisible. You can't divide it. And demons are constantly trying to drive divorce. Constantly. You know, it gets me. People will say things like, oh, well, you know, at a certain point I fell out of love with her. So what? What's that got to do with relationship to your obligations and rights to her as your wife? All that means is what? You have an obligation, as St. Paul says, husband, love your wives. You got to work at this. Marriage is work. And the demons are always trying to get it to, you shouldn't have to work at this. Your spouse should just be doing these things for you. And so the attitude of that somehow or another that you should just divorce, you should fall in love with her, or, oh, it just didn't work out. What do you mean it didn't work out? One of my favorite lines from movies is the one from Adam's Family, Values. There's a certain point in which Morticia says to Gomez, she says, speaking about Fester and the woman, I can't remember what her name was, says, don't they make a lovely couple? And he says, he's a man, she's a woman. Perfect match. All right. In other words, the church has never said that the marriage had to be this hunky-dory, wonderful thing in order for people to have a good and holy marriage. Those are just things that help that. But the demons are constantly trying to chisel away at the sacramental unity. And today, of course, we have the problem of polygamy. It's called divorce and remarriage. Divorce and remarriage. Divorce. That's just serial polygamy. And it's kind of interesting because one of the when the divorce and remarriage question started coming up among the cardinals, it was the Africans of all people, the African cardinals, who are saying, well, that's just serial polygamy, what you guys are saying. Of course, the German bishops got all worked up about it. And then there's the problem of annulments. Now, most annulments, you know, annulments is it's a bit of a problem. What I discovered in the annulments is the scandal isn't so much in the number of the annulments, although it is kind of scandal. The scandal is in how colossally stupid people are in getting married. That's where the scandal is. People today, and you see this among the youth, the young people today do not understand the essence or the fundamentals of marriage at all because of the lack of catechesis. And of course our culture is completely, what is, I mean, you want to ask people, well, what is marriage? What is it? I mean, I don't even think people could even give you a definition of it. Then there's the propagation of the idea, as I mentioned, if it doesn't work, you just get a divorce. The unity has to also be in how you raise your children. This is stuff that you have to work out beforehand. The husband has an obligation to take counsel with his wife in relationship to the children. It's an obligation. The obligation is not a matter of justice, by the way. It's not a matter of justice to the wife that he has to listen to her about the children. The reason he has to listen to her about the children is because she's working with them day in and day out, and she understands them and can give him a viewpoint to where he understands the circumstances properly, and as a result of that, he can actually be prudent. His obligation, if he doesn't listen to his wife about the dispositions of the children and their behavior, he is violating the virtue of prudence. It's sinful. In fact, it's against the fourth commandment. And so he has to take custody. On the other hand, the wife has to get into the disposition of, I'll say my piece, and I'm shutting up, and it's your responsibility. It's your monkey, not mine. And he, by the way, your son does look like a monkey, but that's beside the point. Okay. But there has to be that unity, not allowing the triangulation, being that consistently in that unity. Then there's, of course, fidelity. The demons will attack fidelity. Now, fidelity is the exclusivity in which you're faithful to one individual, and that fidelity is not just in relationship to the conjugal act, it's in relationship to all aspects, intellectually, emotionally, and affections, in all aspects that revolve around the ordering towards marriage or the conjugal act. What does that mean concretely? It means that, you hear people say, well, I can look, but I can't touch. No, you can't even look. You have to practice custody of your eyes. In relationship to affections, in relationship to the conjugal act, or in relationship to the affections, or relationship to romantic, that your wife has an exclusive right to those. Exclusive. Every time a guy does that, contrary to what he's looking, or he's looking at pornography, which is a complete violation of fidelity, then basically what he is doing is he's violating her rights to exclusivity, and vice versa with women. This is why, if a woman notices that that the person they are dating is looking at other, if she's dating some guy and he's constantly looking at other women, don't expect emotional fidelity after marriage. Don't expect it. If the guy, in fact, this is what's so ironic. One of the ways that demons attack fidelity in marriage is through immodesty in women before marriage. What does that mean concretely? They're constantly, because guys are more visual than women. And so what the demons are trying to do is drive the immodesty so that the guy has to keep his custody of the mind, or custody of the eyes. And so what the demons will do is you'll even see this. Women say, I can't seem to find a decent man. Well, maybe if you covered 3/4 of your skin that isn't covered right now, you might have a better luck at it. And they'll look at you like, first of all, women get very angry when you talk about anything that has to do with modesty, or what they're wearing, because it hits home to them. Because women were given a natural inclination to have a proper appearance, to be judged properly by Adam. That's where that came from. But what they do is they'll dress immodestly, and they'll say, well, I don't want him thinking those bad thoughts, but I want him to find me attractive. So you don't want him thinking those bad thoughts, but you want him to have thoughts that are bad in order to attract you. The point being is this: the virtuous man will turn away from what's immodest. If a woman's immodest, a good man is going to ignore her and turn away from her. It doesn't matter how good looking she is. It doesn't matter about her other virtues. If she's not modest, he's not going to pay attention to it. But what happens is that men themselves don't practice custody of the eyes, which is part of modesty. And the demons drive that. They drive the immodesty because they're trying to chisel away at the men's emotional fidelity to their wives or to their girlfriends. Before marriage, it's only once it's clear that the person has sufficient virtue and is willing to enter and can manifest that they can be exclusive in their affections to the individual that you can actually enter into that you actually espouse. That is, you're actually engaged. But what's happening is with all this immodesty, guys don't have this custody of the mind, and so they don't have this emotional fidelity, which then affects the marriage. They attack it by adultery. They attack it when one spouse leaves their former family. This is another way that they chisel away at the fidelity. You see this among men today. I'm like, what is wrong with these guys today? Makes me want to break out some kind of a stick where you beat them. Right? But the point is that these guys, they have a really strong relationship with their brother, their sisters, or their mother, or their father, or what have you. And then when they get married, their emotional affiliation or fidelity is really to their family and not to their wives. And so they won't defend the wife, they won't protect the wife from the bad things that the family does against her, etc. And they always use, well, they're my family. Not anymore. I mean, they are in one sense, but your primary obligation is to your wife. And so you see that lack of fidelity by not even separating from their family. You see this all the time happening among the millennials, unfortunately. The other one is indissolubility. This is the tax on the permanency of marriage. From time to time, I'll get an email from a priest, and they'll ask the question, does a prenuptial agreement invalidate the marriage? It does if, in the prenuptial agreement, it's understood that the marriage isn't permanent. There are some prenuptial agreements that actually don't violate it. So, like, for example, a couple may come together whose both spouses have died, and they decide to get married, they're both 65, but they want their respective properties to go to their respective children. They can enter into a prenuptial agreement so that happens. But ultimately, and this is something that's important, what most people don't realize is, in the end, everything that is owned in the marriage is owned by the husband. Everything in the marriage, all the money of the children under the age of 18, all the money of the wife is, technically speaking, according to the natural law and the entire tradition of the church, the property of the husband. Now, their church is also very clear that they make it that the husband has an obligation to administer that in fairness, in justice, for the sake of his wife. It's not there to hoard stuff. I mean, when you hear about husbands who make their wives go out and work, and then they don't reveal to the wife they're millionaires, which, by the way, I've seen that happen twice. The husband was literally a millionaire and made the wife go out and work to buy food. Okay. The point being is that the prenuptial agreements can actually involve that. But the point is the demons are attacking the indissolubility of marriage. That marriage isn't permanent. Oh, if this doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce. They think that marriage is a human institution. It's just a human contract. No, it's a natural law institution. It's a natural law contract. It's the one that God structured and designed. And so it's Him that you're making these vows before of. Even when you go to a justice of the peace, St. Thomas says, even if you're not standing before a minister of God, if it's a vow or a promise, you're literally swearing before God you're going to fulfill these things, because why? Otherwise, it's not a promise or a vow in the proper sense. So people just go to the justice of the peace, but they don't think that they're swearing before God. Then it's, technically speaking, not marriage. Okay. But the demons are attacking that indissolubility. Why? To get to the children. They want to cause trauma to the various spouses and cause damage to them so that it's hard for them to, they want them to be wounded in the process of divorcing and all that and splitting up, because then it becomes more difficult, because nobody in heaven is wounded. No one. Everybody in heaven has to be healed, because when we're wounded, we put up blockages. And this is true even in relationship to God. You have to be healed in order so that you remove that blockage from God. So everybody in purgatory is healed before they get to heaven. Everybody in hell is completely wounded. And so the demons are trying to replicate that, but the reason they're trying to wound the spouses is so they can create this blockage, this wall between them and God. But it's also to get to the children, because children, again, have a natural law inclination to have love, respect for both parents. And so when they split, the children end up suffering in that process. They attack the sacrament. They attack the sacrament and the sacramental graces. They attack the sacramental validity of these marriages all the time. People are absolutely clueless getting married. When I was a deacon, I decided, I want to work on a tribunal to see how this stuff works, right? So they had me review 13 cases, and some of these cases, the level of ignorance and stupidity was so profound that when you looked at it, you're like, these people never should have gotten a permit to even date, right? I mean, they're just that clueless. And why are they clueless? Because the churches, the demons have done a good job in making sure that the priests don't preach. The catechesis isn't being done about the nature and structure of marriage. What's necessary to have a valid marriage. Most people don't even know that. In fact, when you're preparing people for marriage, it's a quasi-nightmare as a priest. Because literally you have to have this whole list of stuff, and you're like, okay, have you had a prior bond? No. Okay, have you had that? And you have to go through all these things because there's all these different things that can invalidate the marriage. And the number of people that haven't been married before and are getting married for the first time, who aren't shacking up or having sex, who are actually both Catholic and are actually leading their Catholic lives, even in a traditional parish, is maybe 1 in 10. You're like, in fact, as one priest said, I would rather bury my father 5 days after he buried his father than perform a marriage. It's that bad sometimes. Because of the fact that you're constantly dealing with people's emotions, etc. And as a priest, when you realize that people have issues, you have to slow it down, and then they're chaffing at the priest about it, and then they want to set the date before they're really even prepared, and it's just a nightmare. But the point being is that this is how the demons use, these are the things the demons use to attack the validity, to get people to enter into marriage in an invalid way. This is also how they got modernists to hijack the diocesan programs in relationship to marriage prep. I mean, some of these things, you go to these marriage preps. I actually wrote an article once. I wanted to do it under a pseudonym, but the editor said, oh, no, you don't. This has to be put out in your own name. And basically in there I talk about the fact that to go into a group of couples who are mixed, they're not married yet, they're already struggling with chastity, and then you're going to talk about anatomical details of NFP in mixed company, and you really think that's a mature approach? You're just going to end up with a bunch of people having to go to confession before this is all over with. There's attacks to block various ways of graces given to marriage. Demons can cause people to forget that the sacramental graces of marriage are not just on the day of your marriage, but every single day. You can actually draw on the sacrament every single day. The graces, and this is how you combat it, depending on it. The graces are for the spouses to have fidelity and dissolvability in their relationship. It's actually, the graces are there to help them to deal with each other's imperfections and to help to raise children. That's what the graces are structured for. And so a lot of times people don't work at drawing on the sacramental graces, and they keep demons from actually looking at that. The demons keep the people from looking at the necessity of drawing upon the graces of the sacrament on a regular basis. Demons seem to block actual graces to help spouses to live together who suffer from defects of original and actual sin. They'll constantly, the one spouse will pray and pray and pray and pray and pray for the other spouse. And what do the demons do? They just step in and just pick at the guy's emotions or pick at the woman's emotions to keep them from responding to the graces. They drive the vices in one spouse to drag the other one down spiritually. And this is part of it. A lot of times people will come to me, and it's both men and women, where the wife is a complete mess or the husband's a complete mess, and they're struggling with this, and they fail to realize that it's precisely through their spouse that they're going to grow holy, as I mentioned before. You have to see marriage as an opportunity of grace. Demons have blocked that from people's minds. Then, of course, the demons are working on attacking marriage by the state. This is appalling. The state has gained way too much ascendancy. These people have gotten way too big for their britches. The fact that they think that they can step in and make determinations, regarding the structure and nature of marriage. The fact that they can actually determine the definition of marriage. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.
Christus vincit, Christus Christus in